Hello, this is Devlog 3 of my series on releasing a game before Christmas. In this video I will be generating and adding the first enemy, as well as some work on the core mechanics. So the first thing I needed to add an enemy was a new enemy mesh, and in line with the killing sheep theme of the game, I thought the best enemy would be a wolf. So I used the Python script which generates the sheep mesh as a base, and asked the AI to use it to generate a wolf instead. However, it wasn't very successful and just returned a smaller sheep. So you can see here how long it took me from the timestamps of my video recording. There were just so many issues. Primarily the mesh looking nothing like a sheep, but also the skeleton system was offset, and so it prohibited me from making animations. However, after some more pretty pathetic attempts, I was finally able to get something which looked somewhat like a wolf, and that I was happy with for an early build of the game. I do feel like I'm refining the process, though, of using AI to generate these meshes. However, it's just a pity it took 4.5 hours. And then I added a really simple token move animation for the wolf. This is just so I can hook it up and replace it with something else later. So next I needed to construct the new wolf prefab. This required a lot of fiddling about and some new object mapping. However, a lot of this core game logic will be rewritten later in the video. So I also changed the enemy target from the player to the sheep pen, and here you can see everything running smoothly. So one thing I wanted to fix, and then hopefully never touch again, was the day-night cycle. I noticed that the sun was shining through the underside of the map during the night, and then so the underside of the game objects would be illuminated, which is especially obvious on the sheep. So I added code to handle the dimming of the sunlight and the moonlight, depending on whether the sun is higher than the moon, or vice versa. I also changed the day and night skybox to make the night a lot darker. And so here's the result of the day-night cycle refactor. There's no more underside glare on the game objects, and it actually feels like nighttime as well now. So the next thing I wanted to add was the concept of stats, and I took this from my other game as I know the code, and it was pretty much the same, just with a little less. And so these stats are obviously going to be used to dictate several characteristics of the game object. And for now, we'll be using speed as an example. Another piece of important functionality which was implemented was the ability to define the stat values for an item or an enemy. For example, changing the wolf speed. So these values will be stored in JSON files under the config folder in the resources. I then wrote code which will step through these enemy configs, ingest their stats, and save them against the file name. So this allows me to look up the stats of any enemy, and it also prevents me from loading from resources every time I want to use these stats. I'm also implementing object hierarchy here. So the player and enemy prefab will be extensions of the character prefab, and the wolf prefab and any other enemy prefab will obviously be an extension of the enemy prefab. And this just allows extensions of an object to inherit various behaviors from its parent. This is a very core concept to programming. It's called object-oriented programming, and specifically in this case, the concept of a hierarchy and inheritance. In layman's terms, this means if I wanted to add a new property to the stats of all characters across the game, whether they're the player or the enemy or the sheep, I would add this to the character base class, and this would propagate to all instances of the character class, including the player, the enemies, and the sheep. This is because all these classes extend the base character class. So as mentioned earlier, speed was the test use case for this. And as you can see, I go into the config JSON, change the speed, and the wolf speed has been updated. And that's all from this devlog. Not sure what will be in the next one. Perhaps adding a new enemy. If you want to find out, please subscribe, and thanks for watching.